Hello and welcome back to Reach, a GABC Students podcast. My name is Max and I'm the youth pastor here at Golden Acres Baptist Church. And today I have one of my students here with me, Dylan Chain, and we're going to be talking about how to be in but not of the world. And I know that's a topic that maybe isn't discussed a whole lot outside of church. Maybe you're not familiar even with what that means. And so if that's the case, make sure you stick around for this episode to hear Dylan and I discuss about what it means to be in the world, but not of the world. So make sure you stick around and enjoy this episode. Dylan, another one of our leadership team members, a 10th grader, right?
Yep.
10th grade at Central, another one of our public schools in the area. And so Dylan, before we start talking about our topic today, I want to give you a little bit of a chance to talk about your faith, right? That's how we open every episode. And we do that in 3 parts, right? What was your life like before Jesus? When did you decide to place your faith in him? And what has he done in your life since then? So share a little bit about your faith background and your relationship with Christ.
My knowledge of Christ began a long time ago, but I never truly understood until the first time I went to camp. My life before Jesus was empty and it had no meaning. I tried to find meaning in the people I was surrounded with instead of God, and it wasn't working. I decided to give it all to God in the summer of 2023 at camp. He gave me a purpose and led me to volunteer in the children's ministry for a while, and he led me to sign up for the leadership team. And he gave me new friends who pushed me toward him and not away from him.
Yeah, and so that's super cool that you say that, because you and I have known each other for a long time, longer than most anyone in our group. I can remember back chaperoning at a kids camp where you were actually in my room as like a 4th grader. So super cool to kind of see where you're at now as a leader in this youth group, and to kind of see how your walk with God has progressed and what he's kind of been doing in your life. And I think it's something really cool that we can all kind of see, like especially at camp when you did really get on fire for like missions and that kind of thing, and really getting into evangelism and all of those different things that God's kind of started doing in your life since then. And so I think it's a great topic that you picked for this episode, right? So as we kind of get into being in but not of the world, right? Kind of a church phrase, not something you hear a whole lot outside of the church. So it may be something people have no idea about, or it may be something that they've heard but they don't really know what it means. So Dylan, I want you to take your best shot at explaining that phrase, what we really mean when we say being in but not of the world.
The phrase being in but not of the world to me means to stay strong in your faith and keep your eyes on God while you're surrounded by the temptations and all the negative things in the world. And for us as teenagers, that can mean to choose the right friends instead of putting ourselves constantly around bad influences and people. For students, it can mean to not let school overwhelm us and to keep God on top of our priorities and to trust He'll make everything work out in His will.
Yeah, and I think it's really good what you mentioned about like surrounding ourselves with the right people and surrounding ourselves with things, consuming things that are going to bring us closer to God and not take us further away. Because we can all see that the world doesn't really have it figured out. Right? Like the world is pretty messed up. And we know we can't love both the world and God. Like Jesus himself tells us that pretty clearly. But I think the idea of being in but not of the world is a great topic, but you won't find a verse in the Bible that says that. Like this is really an idea that comes from John chapter 17. And what we see in John chapter 17 is Jesus praying for his disciples, and so he's talking to God. He says this in verse 14 of John 17. He says, I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, for they are not of the world any more than I am of the world. So he lays out that God is not of the world, and so anyone who follows God should not be of this world, because they're following God in a way that isn't of the world. Like the way of Christ is totally counter to the things of this world. And because the world is full of sin, we shouldn't look like the world unless we're following after the world. So Jesus says we're not of the world, but then in verse 15, he says something that's really interesting to me. He says, my prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. So he says, don't take them out of the world, right? Talking about the disciples and, talking about us as Christians, not to take us out of the world. So we're not to be of the world, but the answer is not for us to get out. Right? It's not for us to kind of withdraw or just kind of shelter ourselves. Because he goes on to say, they are not of the world, even as I am not of it. Sanctify them by the truth of your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. So Jesus says we're not of the world. But God, just like you sent me here for a purpose, Jesus says, look, I've sent them into the world for a purpose. So when we look at the idea that the world is not doing so great, right? It's a messed up place, but we've been sent here for a purpose, right? Our answer is not to just remove ourselves from everything, put ourselves in a bubble, and never go outside. Like, that's not the answer. Jesus said, don't take them out. I've sent them here for a purpose. So, Dylan, how do we as Christians practically engage with the world? Like, how do we be in the world when it is so full of sin?
We don't necessarily have a choice but to interact with the world. As Christians, it's a little tougher, though, because the world tries to hold us to a higher standard, and if we mess up, they're really quick to call us out on it. But we can't dwell on that because we're going to mess up and we aren't perfect. So for us to interact with the world, we just have to keep our eyes on God and not worry about what the world has to say about us.
Yeah. And so why would you say it's so important for us to not hide or shelter ourselves? Like you said, like we can't really hide ourselves. We can't really shelter ourselves from the world. Why is it important for us to be in the world?
It's important for us as Christians to not hide ourselves from the world, but to go out and share the gospel and do our best to spread God's love, which is our mission as his followers.
Yeah, right. Like our faith is not meant to be private. Like, yes, faith is an individual decision that we all have to make, but like, it's not meant to be kept to yourself. And so, I do think we can kind of go to opposite extremes at times. And like, our group is real unique in the fact that we have private school kids, we've got public school kids, we've got homeschool kids. Like, we kind of span all demographics of school. And I think that's really cool because when we're here, all these different groups kind of come together and grow together, and it's really cool to see. But I think there's different temptations that come for those groups, right? Like in a public school where you're at, and even in private schools where I went, so I can attest to that. Like the world can be tempting. Like it can be tempting to just fit in and do what's easy and what everyone else is doing, and then for homeschool students and private school students fit into this one as well. Like it can be tempting to just kind of withdraw and only surround ourselves with Christians and try and kind of shelter ourselves from the outside world. And the problem with both of those, right, is that like you said, we have been called to share the gospel, to make disciples, and called to be in but not of the world. And so, on a practical level, like how can we share our faith if there's nobody around us to hear it? Like if we're only surrounded by people that are like-minded and look like us, believe like us, how effective will we really be for the kingdom? Like if we're around people sharing our faith, we got to make sure, like you said, our actions line up with that, right? And I know there's a lot of our students that go to school with you, and so that can also play a part. Like if I'm gonna proclaim to be a Christian, if I'm going to step up and be a leader, like I got to make sure my actions are matching this. So the threat, right, the world is not merely external, right? And what I mean by that is that, yes, there are things in this world that we've got to protect ourselves from, but so often we need protection from ourselves, right? Because temptation and sin really start from our own desires. Like, yeah, peer pressure is a thing, but it all starts with our own desires. And so when it comes to this Christian life, the real threat is internal because, yeah, the world is stained by sin and broken, but so are we. And so before we trust Jesus, we can't do anything on our own. But once we trust him, he promises to do a new work in us, but we've got to make sure we're guarding our hearts, right? Just like Proverbs 4:23 says, like guard your heart. And then Jeremiah 17:9 says, behold, the heart is deceitful above all things. So when people say, follow your heart, don't. Like, your heart is deceitful. Like, we have sinful desires. Like, we can't always follow our heart. Like, we've got to guard our heart against the things of this world. And so the reason we need to be in but not of, like, we've got to look at it and say the threat is not all external, right? I've got to guard against my own flesh, my own selfish desires. Like, I can be in this world and not of it because I'm just as tempted to sin in my own heart as I am in this world. And so changing our perspective, right, from that the world is evil and I'm good, and so I've got to protect me, to, God is good and the world and myself included are fallen and sinful, right? And so I play a role in that sinfulness, but I've also been called to play a role in the healing of the world by bringing that good news of Jesus. And so when we talk about bringing the good news, right, sharing the gospel, making disciples, all those things, what is kind of the reaction you get at school? Like when you say you're a Christian, or when you share your faith, or maybe you post something, or people just know like that you're on a Christian church podcast. Like, what's kind of the reaction from people at school? Kind of the reaction from the world that you see?
The people at school who know I'm a Christian don't really react to it because they're really like my close group of friends, and they're also Christians, or at least say they are. They don't always act like it, But the people that aren't in my friend group, they're in my friend group, but I don't talk to them daily. Like, they're in the bigger circle. They know I'm Christian, but they don't really interact with me as much because they aren't as religious as the people I talk to on a daily. They have been asked a couple questions about it, and I'll bring it up sometimes, and they ask why I believe, but I don't know. I just don't always answer the best, I feel like, and it doesn't bring them closer, and I feel like it doesn't give a great reaction, like, in their mind about it.
Yeah, well, I think to speak to a couple things you said, right? Like you said, you don't always say the right thing. Well, there's not a wrong thing that you can say, right? That's what it comes back to with evangelism, right? Like, so often people are crippled by that fear of, what if I say the wrong thing? What if I mess up? If I push them further away from God? But like, the only wrong thing you can say is nothing, right? Anytime you open up and just show them that you have the courage to even talk about this, like, it speaks to them. And right, we really can't judge success or failure based on the outcome. All we can do is be obedient to Christ, to go and share like he's called us to. Outcome is totally up to him, but obedience is on us. And then to touch on another thing you said about, like, when you share your faith at school, and like that a lot of your friends maybe are Christians, or like you said, claim to be, but don't always show it. Like, that's not something for us to necessarily like determine, right? Like, we're not looking at people saying you're a Christian, you're not, you're like, but Scripture does say, like, you'll know a tree by its fruit, like you'll know my people by the way they live. And so I think that's an opportunity even to share your faith in those circles, right? So often, like, me growing up at Glenwood, going to a private, like, Christian school, like, the excuse was real easy to say, like, well, everyone's here's a Christian. Everyone here claims to know God. Like, there's nobody I can share my faith with here. But we all know there's people that claim to know God that maybe do know about him, but they don't really know him. Because if they were, their lives would reflect that. And so it's really not enough to just say I'm a Christian, right? So often people your age will say they're a Christian because maybe they do go to church, but they're not really involved, or because their parents are Christians and that's what they know, and so they claim that, or they go to a Christian school, and so they claim that. And so they kind of claim a faith that maybe they aren't really living. And so it's asking, even in those circles, even when someone says they're a Christian, like, yeah, like, tell me about your faith. Like, what does your faith mean to you? Like, this is what my faith means to me. And starting those conversations, because we know at the end of the day, being a Christian isn't what saves you, right? Going to church isn't what saves you. The only thing that saves you is placing your faith in what Jesus has done for you, right? That he paid the penalty we couldn't pay, and saying, God, I give my life to you. Like, I'm not in control, you are. So it's sharing that message that is what we should be so passionate about, and is what should drive us to be in the world. Not to be of the world, not to look like the world, but to go and make disciples, to be around people that maybe don't believe like we do, to put ourselves in, settings that there may be unbelievers around us. Like, this may be a little bit uncomfortable, but it's going to help me share the gospel, and I can leverage this for Christ. But we do have to be careful with that and not put ourselves in places where we're going to fail, where we're going to stumble or be, pulled away from God. And so what are some practical kind of safeguards that you can put in place? Like, how do we make sure that we don't end up looking like the world when we are in the world and surrounded by all this different stuff?
For us to make sure that we don't look like the world, we have to consistently keep God on top of everything in our lives. The things we have to say no to as Christians are temptations that the world says is okay, such as getting drunk, and lust, which the world says is completely acceptable. But being involved in the church and having a community of friends and a church group as close as family has helped me in ways I wouldn't have been sure I could have done without them. They've helped me grow in my faith and given me a safe space to share my doubts and concerns and have someone who will listen and respond, and leaders who just want me to be the best Christian I can be.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what you said there was really good about having the right people in place, right? That if they do see me start to look like the world, they can speak into that, right? And then making sure that we are still holding ourselves accountable, right? Not even relying on other people to, but holding ourselves like, these are the things I'm going to say no to, right? And deciding that ahead of time. That's something we talk about a lot in youth, of not waiting until you're in the moment of temptation to try to make the right choice. Because if you do that, you're going to fail 99% of the time. But if you decide ahead of time, this school year, if I'm invited out to a party where I know they're going to be drinking, doing this stuff, I'm just going to say no. I'm deciding that now, so I don't even have to think about it when I'm asked. I've already made that decision. Or, before I even enter into this relationship, I'm deciding now these are the boundaries we're going to have. And so in that moment, I'm not even going to be tempted by it. I know these are the boundaries I've set, and I'm not compromising on that. So there are things that we've got to say no to that the world really does say are acceptable, because that's what's out there. That's what everything has become so normalized by. And so having that community of friends and a group at church or at school is really important, because it comes back to that idea of accountability, right? And that's a word we use a lot in church that maybe isn't as talked about outside, but it's being a part of a group, right, that allows us, as it says in the Bible, right, because two are better than one, because they can pick each other up. And it also says a threefold cord is not easily broken, meaning a rope that's weaved together and essentially three in one is a lot harder to break. And it's the same thing with us when we kind of grow together. So I think one of the biggest safeguards we can have is accountability, right? Having that group that you're accountable to, a group where if we're straying or starting to look like the world, we have people who are willing to say hey, that's not what we're going to do. That's not what God wants for us, right? He has something better for us. And the other thing that I would say is a good safeguard is just remembering our mission, right? Understanding our goal, right? We're not here simply to avoid sin. If that was the case, we could go home, lock the doors, barricade the windows, cut off all power to the outside world, and live our lives void of sin. But how effective are we really going to be there? If that's the main goal, we're not going to bring anybody with us to heaven. That's not the goal. If we love God, we're going to resist temptation and follow Him. But if I stand before God and I say, I went to church every Sunday, I read my Bible every day, I had all these Christian friends, He's going to be like, all right, that's great, but did you make disciples? Did you share your faith with anyone? So understanding that our true mission is to go and make disciples, right? That's the Great Commission. And to do that, we have to be in the world, because the world is lost and is headed towards destruction. And we were too, but Jesus, right? But God stepped in and made a way for us. And so that's the message of hope that we've got to bring out into the world. And if we keep that to ourselves, think about the missed opportunities that are out there. Because there's people in your schools that'll never set foot into this building. right? That'll never come to a church service, never be a part of youth, may not ever even listen to this podcast, but they're going to see you in class every day because that's the way their schedule lined up. And so, how are you sharing in that moment, right? There's people on your sports teams, or there's people all in our life that God has put there for a purpose, because we don't believe anything happens by accident. Like, God has ordained everything in our lives, and so it's being that light in every situation, right? Having peers, having mentors that can provide accountability, but us also remembering why we're here, because that kind of reframes and refocuses everything for us. And so, Dylan, this has been super great. I really appreciate you sharing all this different stuff about how to be in but out of the world. I think you've given some great advice about what that looks like and also how to kind of navigate that in a Christ-like way. But any final thoughts or kind of additional advice that you would give before we wrap up?
Not too much, but just to do it even if you're scared, because God's always going to have your best interest in his heart, and he's not going to let anything happen to you that he doesn't think you can handle. And to grow a community of friends and to be involved in the church, because I know that's helped me a lot.
Yeah. I think just to kind of touch on one of those things before we wrap up is like you talked about doing it even when you feel that fear, right? If we wait for there to never be fear, if we wait for the perfect opportunity to share Christ, it's never going to come. Like, if you wait for someone to walk up to you and be like, hey, tell me how to be a Christian. Like, if that happens, awesome. Jump on that opportunity. But likely that's not going to happen. You're going to have to maybe initiate that conversation. You've got to bring Jesus into the conversation. And that can be a scary thing, especially at school and when the world does look so different from us. But I heard it said before that, like, courage is not the absence of fear, right? Courage is feeling that fear but choosing to do the thing anyway, right? Feeling that fear but knowing I'm trusting in God. I'm going to choose to be strong and courageous like he called Joshua to be and like he's calling me to be, and I'm going to share my faith anyway. I'm going to stand up for what's right anyway. Like, that fear is still there, but I'm going to choose faith. I'm going to choose to be courageous because I know ultimately obedience is up to me. The outcome is up to God. So as long as I'm being obedient to God, I'm going to be in right standing with him, and I'm going to be walking in his will. And so I think all this has been super good, Dylan. If it's been of any help to you, if you've gained something from this, some knowledge about what it means to be in but not of the world, share this with somebody. And there's so many good moments in this episode about what it really means to navigate this culture and to be in a school and have friends that are building you up and helping you along this mission of sharing Christ, but not falling into the trap of becoming like the world and getting lost in that current of culture. So if it's been of help, share it with somebody. Make sure you follow us, subscribe to make sure you never miss another episode, because it's just so awesome to see our students sharing their faith and talking about these topics that are applicable to anybody. Middle school, high school, adult, like public, private, doesn't matter where you're at. This is real life stuff that can help us along our walk with Christ. And so hopefully it reaches somebody out there. It speaks to somebody out there that needed to hear this, because that's the whole goal of this podcast. That's why it's called Reach, because we want to reach people with this message of hope, that we can be in a lost and broken world, but not of it, because we have a hope that is secure in what Christ did on the cross and in his resurrection. And so, thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.